So, hello everyone. Welcome to yet another wonderful seminar organized by the UNSW Institute for Cyber. I begin today with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today. For me, that's the Ngunnawal people or any of the traditional people where you are as you speak. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. My name is Frank den Hartog. I'm an expert in security of wireless systems at UNSW Canberra, and I'm also the Deputy Head of School of Postgraduate Teaching at the School of Engineering and IT here. It's an honor for me to introduce to you the speaker of today, Professor Russell Smith. I guess, you know, one of the most eminent criminologists in this country. And it's really great that he is here with us to speak with us. Professor Smith is a professor at the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University, and is also a fellow and former president of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology, and an honorary fellow at the Australian Institute of Criminology. Today, he will speak about counting the costs of cybercrime in Australia in 2021. And it's an honor for me to give the floor to you, Professor Smith, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Good, thank you very much. And thanks to the Institute for Cyber for the invitation to present this material to you. I'd like to talk about this question of how we quantify how much cybercrime costs in the country in Australia by looking at some research that was done by me and colleagues at the Australian Institute of Criminology over a number of years. But the most recent was a paper written by myself and my colleague who has now left the Institute, Amelia Hickman, in which we looked at the cost of and prevalence of cybercrime amongst individual victims of cybercrime in Australia. So I'll refer to that in passing, dealing with the individual side of it. And we'll also look at some of the questions about how much it's costing business, and in particular, governments. You know, what do governments actually spend in terms of victimisation, and how much do they spend in preventing and responding to cybercrime? But I might start. I can just move my slides on. By asking the question, why do we really know, why do we need to know what cybercrime is costing? You know, there's a lot of time, effort and money put into doing research on trying to answer this question. And I think it's worth thinking about what the benefits are in doing this type of research. Three main areas. Firstly, in terms of trends and typologies, doing research like this gives you some baseline data that you can then use to assess how the situation is changing over time. It also gives you information about the targets and methodologies that people use to commit these types of offences. And importantly, if you've got a global figure about how much cybercrime is costing in Australia, then you can compare it with other jurisdictions and countries around the world. Bearing in mind that a lot of it uses slightly different methodologies, so you have to be very careful doing cross-jurisdictional comparisons. Most importantly, and particularly from a government point of view, if you have an estimate of how much cybercrime is costing, you can use that to promote the problem, to get government funding and interest in allocating resources, and particularly resources for law enforcement, for detection policing, investigation and prosecution of cybercrime. Often it's very hard for governments to take up an initiative unless they've got some indication of how much money is involved and what the benefits, the cost benefits would be eventually if you did take action. There's also the need to allocate cybercrime prevention resources for business and government itself and individuals to some extent. And again, if you know how much it's costing, then that gives you a good argument for spending more money on prevention resources. And finally, there's the question of awareness raising, and often, you know, these global figures about how much a particular type of crime costs is used to raise awareness amongst the community, particularly individuals, business operators, particularly small businesses. If they see how much people are losing through cybercrime, they can then take efforts to prevent their own victimisation. So I think there's good justifications for doing this sort of research. It's not a simple problem, and there's many difficulties and pitfalls along the way in trying to arrive at well worked out and effective estimates of the costs involved. First major difficulty is distinguishing cybercrime from other types of criminality. So what is the definition that we're going to use in doing this sort of work? There's two main broad categories of cybercrime, which is, you know, the social scientific criminological side of cyber illegality, which is focusing on often victims and offenders, and the sort of work in costing comes into that area. That needs to be distinguished from cybersecurity, which is probably a more technological, electrical engineering, IT professional side of the problem. Those two groups need to speak to themselves, and you certainly need to have some understanding of the other's discipline when you're doing this work. There's innumerable definitions of cybercrime that have developed over the years, over the last 25 years or so since research was being done in this area. And I think probably it's worth positing the broad distinction between cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. Pure cybercrime or computer-dependent crime is simplest to understand, I think. It's illegal access to networks and systems, disrupting the operation of computer systems and networks. Cyber-enabled crime are all of those other crimes, and particularly economic crimes that make use of computer technologies to allow the offence to be committed. And that extends from all the various forms of fraud, using computers in connection with even volume crimes such as burglaries or automobile theft, particularly now that cars are full of computers, and all the personal crimes, even some types of violent crime that are facilitated through the use of IT, such as online child abuse, which is an ever-increasing problem. When we're counting particular types of crimes in this area, we need to be very careful for overlapping of categories, and things like cybercrime, identity misuse, payment fraud. A lot of those types of crimes are counted by separate types of institutions. There might be banks for payment fraud, government departments for identity crime, and if you use the figures from those institutions without knowing the extent to which they're overlapping, then you're going to have problems in calculating how much is going on and what the losses are. And then we also need to think about the victim sectors involved, and the three large groups, of course, are individuals, so computer users, businesses, small, medium and large, and also government agencies. And in Australia, with our federal system, we've got the problem of getting statistics and data from both states and territories and the Commonwealth, and that has its own set of difficulties. Some of the data issues are that a lot of cost of crime analysis makes use of police recorded statistics. And in this area, not very many crimes are taken to the police for investigation and eventual prosecution. Often the offenders in these cases are based overseas, and without going through extradition proceedings, it's very difficult to mount an action in Australia in one of our jurisdictions. Incidents and victimisation data really don't exist effectively for a lot of the cybercrime types that we're interested in. There really is not adequate research on some of the types of crimes that have been done to date. Sometimes if we rely on the private sector sources of information or some of the government research, the sample sizes are really quite small, and so it's difficult to extrapolate to national estimates of loss. So we need to be reasonably careful about some of the the industry surveys that have been conducted. There's also the problem of looking at cases that don't come to the attention of the authorities, so unrecorded or undetected cybercrimes that people experience but don't let anyone know about. And in that case, we need to go to survey research, which asks individuals and business operators how much cybercrime they've experienced and what sort of losses they have sustained. That information can then be used to give you an estimate of how much crime is not brought to the attention of the authorities, and you need to use those multipliers on the officially recorded information so that you get a global figure of how much is taking place. There's very poor amounts of information on a lot of the indirect costs involved in cyber victimisation. So medical expenses, all of the intangible costs, damage to business reputations, and similarly, a lot of the prevention activities and also the response activities by individuals, businesses and governments really are not recorded very effectively in many cases, and the cost estimates of those activities also aren't quantified. So there's a great deal of extra research that needs to be done, and the best we can do is really make use of the information that's available and try and fill in the gaps with some form of mathematical extrapolation of the findings that we have. So we're going to end up with estimates that are probably the best that we can do at the moment on the basis of the information that's available, but there's really going to be a need for more research in the future. We also need to distinguish, particularly looking at prevention and response activities by business and government, the costs, the amount of money that those organisations spend on dealing with IT security issues, as opposed to computer problems that have arisen from criminal activity. There's a lot of money spent, as we know as individuals, on keeping your computers functioning properly, but not all of that is directly attributable to the risks of criminality. So it's actually very difficult to disaggregate how much is really related to crime and how much is due to just the problems of maintaining an effective computer system. So they're the background things that we need to think about as we try and proceed with doing these costing exercises. Now, to give you some idea of the types of figures that are floating around over the last 15, 20 years, I'll just mention some of these figures. This is a small selection of the types of global costs that have been calculated in different countries. In Australia, one of the first and largest studies that was done of computer security in the business world was by the Australian Institute of Criminology back in 2006, 2007. And this was an enormous survey. I think it was 11,840 businesses were sampled from right across Australia. So it's a very large sample, and we're able to produce some quite reliable data on what businesses were experiencing with computer security right throughout Australia. We came up with a range of 595 million to 649 million being spent on computer security by businesses at that time. It might seem a relatively low amount, but this is what businesses actually reported to us, and we extrapolated that out to the whole of the country. Later one, in 2011, the UK Cabinet Office engaged some consultants to do a survey of what cybercrime costs, and they came up with a figure of £7 billion for the year 2011. That was fairly extensively criticised because they included too many types of loss that perhaps were not directly related to cybercrime as they defined it. The evidence base was also not very robust, so there was quite a lot of academic criticism about that figure, and the Home Office went away and a few years later produced a much more confined estimate of what cybercrime was costing in terms of direct losses and also prevention and response costs, and that was $1.1 billion for 2015-16 year, considerably less than the industry estimate earlier. More recently, the Australian Institute of Criminology has been looking at the problem of organised crime, and in 2016-17, we did some research with the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission and came up with a range of estimates of organised cybercrime. So this is that proportion of cybercrime that's conducted by serious and organised crime groups. And that range was 521 million to 937 million, so slightly under $1 billion. Most recently, the Australian Institute of Criminology has conducted a very extensive and detailed search study of pure cybercrime. So this is only the computer-dependent crime affecting individuals. So this is not looking at businesses and government victims at all. And the total of that was $3.5 billion for the year 2018 to 19. And that's a very reliable estimate for those pure cybercrime only costs for individuals. Recently, our colleague at the University of New South Wales, Nigel Fair, whose book I'm holding up here, has come up with his estimate of what cybercrime more generally costs in Australia of $42 billion. And this is a much broader category that includes not only pure cybercrime, but also a lot of the cyber-enabled crime that we see, and also some of the indirect costs as well. Overseas, there have been some extravagant estimates, including one by the Science Organization that put it at $10.5 trillion US, which is the expected figure for 2025. And again, that's a global estimate, so they've attempted to either gather information from all countries and where that doesn't exist, they've extrapolated figures out. So an extremely large amount. What I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in this presentation's focusing just on pure cybercrime. I'll explain why shortly, but this is published in a report by the AIC, Statistical Bulletin number 34, and the focus is on these principal categories of pure cybercrime. So unauthorised access to networks, sometimes known as hacking or cracking systems. Secondly, modification of data and impairment of systems. So all of the types of criminal disruption of computers that we see. And then there's forms of malfunctioning systems that individuals experience, which they don't have a direct understanding of the cause, but it's very likely that that's motivated or committed by criminals. And so if you ask people what computer problems they've experienced, they'll come up with some that aren't directly unauthorised access or disruption cases, but they still have an element of criminality about them. And we've attempted to look at that for individuals, businesses and government agencies. So those three types. Now, what we've used in this area is a crime statistics approach to costing cybercrime, and I'll just go through this very, very quickly. This is a sort of plan of action that you use when you're trying to arrive at a global estimate. Firstly, you need to define the types of cybercrime that you're looking at. The cyber-dependent or cyber-enabled. We're not looking at cyber-enabled for this purpose. What hasn't been included are all the regulatory offences that might be relevant to offending as well. At the moment, we're really just focusing on starting with the criminal statistics and not looking at just regulatory offences that might come to the ACCC or ASIC or other government departments. So you start by looking at the number of officially recorded crimes. Then, as I said, you need to determine a multiplier to give you an estimate of how much crime is in what's called the dark figure of unrecorded or undetected crime. Cybercrime has much higher multipliers than many other types of crimes. You can think of violent crimes that you certainly know when you've been victimised and you report that to the police. In cybercrime, many people say it's not really worth the trouble to report it officially. The police are really not going to be able to find the offenders and take action and recover any losses that have been incurred. Then the third step is to apply some unit cost estimates to those incident statistics for each of the crime types that you're looking at. And that's, again, dependent on there being unit cost estimates available. So there's some research saying that how much an act of computer hacking results in damage to your bank account through what's happened, but there's not a great deal of research that is really reliable in that sense. So added to those costs, we put in any indirect costs that might be involved. So these are human costs. They might be things like some of the intangible costs that are difficult to measure in dollar terms, lost output where people's systems aren't working for a period of time, reinstatement costs, once problems arisen. We add in prevention costs, so what individuals, businesses and governments spend in preventing criminality in this area, and also in repairing their systems once they've been damaged. And again, it's very difficult to relate that specifically to actual criminality as opposed to other forms of damage that have occurred. Then finally, we need to take into account costs that have been recorded in multiple categories that we've looked at. So you want to avoid double counting the same losses for different sectors of the calculation. And then we also need to deduct any proceeds of crime that people have recovered directly from offenders after legal action, or perhaps through insurance payments, and also any compensation payments that have been received where there might have been personal harm suffered by individuals. So that's the broad brush approach to dealing with these types of calculations. Now, some of the issues that we face when doing this are, firstly, we've excluded all of the computer-enabled crime. And I think as we move into the 21st century, it's becoming the case that almost all crime has an element of digital technologies underpinning it in some sense, apart from probably some very direct forms of violent crime. But as I said, even violent crime involving sexual abuse of children or production of child abuse material has an element of computers involved. So the computer-enabled crime cost will probably be extremely large and approaching what the cost of all crime is. With prevention and response costs, there's a proportion of these costs that are incurred by individuals, businesses and governments that relate to computer security, but these don't necessarily relate to the actual prevention or response to criminal activities. In the latest research by the ARC, we estimated individuals had spent $2 billion and businesses had spent $2.4 billion on these prevention and response costs to pure cybercrime in 2018 to 19. So that's a very large proportion of the actual losses. So again, we're focusing on these aspects of pure cybercrime listed here on the slide. Now, these are the figures that we've come up with. The report that we've got available, or there's a couple of reports that are relevant here, available, and you can spend many hours going through the intricacies of the figures involved, but I'll just give you the global figures. In terms of individuals, we relied mainly on the AIC's national survey for pure cybercrime that was completed looking at the year 2018 to 19. That was published in 2021. So the direct losses were $1.9 billion, less about 388 million in recoveries, and extrapolating that out to 2021 figures, we end up with a total net economic loss of $3.397 billion for 2020 to 21. Turning to businesses, we have a lot of gaps in the information that were available. So we started with the very large-scale survey I mentioned, the Abacus survey in 2009 by the AIC, which gave some good indications of the extent of the problem, and also the losses involved. We've also used the latest Australian Cybersecurity Centre threat assessment figures and used those to break up the findings from the AIC's work into losses for small, medium and large organisations. And you can see there the individual costs. We've used a multiplier of 12.5, which represents an assumption that about 8% of these cases were being reported officially. So that in the absence of any better figures, we've had to use that for small, medium and large businesses. And I think we need further research to refine the multipliers for those cases. And you can see the net cost figures there. That's $7 million for small businesses, 74 for medium, and 358 million for large organisations. With governments, again, we've relied on those two surveys. We had about 566 reports with a mean loss of $5,900, and we've used that same multiplier, leading to a net cost of $41.7 million. In terms of prevention and response costs, these varied for individuals, businesses, and we weren't able to really disaggregate the losses for government agencies. In all, governments were spending $33.5 billion on computer security, but we really don't know the proportion of that related to criminality. So we have some estimates, and again, they're fairly large amounts of money that are spent on prevention and response. So putting all those figures together, we end up with about $8 billion odd for pure cybercrime costs for 2020 to 21 in those three sectors. Now, some of the issues that I just want to briefly mention. Firstly, when you're doing the analysis and reporting of these types of figures, you need to think about those problems of disaggregating the costs of cybercrime from other crime types, avoiding double counting, and thinking about whether you want to report the raw findings or the cost proportion of GDP. And using a proportional figure is much more useful if you're trying to do comparisons across jurisdictions or across countries. In terms of trend analysis, you have to be very careful in looking at the criminal environment at the time and making sure that you don't just say that the changes that you're observing are due to changes in criminality alone. There might be other changes in the society that's taking place. And I think a good example of this is COVID. In 2020, there was an enormous increase in cases of consumer scams reported to ScamWatch as the pandemic developed, and these increased beyond 2020 into 2021 and even today. So looking at the environment that crimes are taking place in is important. You also need to look at the changes that might take place in individuals, businesses and governments changing the way they're responding to cybercrime. So if they're altering the prevention activities that they're taking, then that needs to be considered before you attribute the losses solely to changes in criminality. And finally, in reporting, governments often use these sort of findings to show that they're doing very well. Cybercrime costs might be falling, so that shows that the government's taken appropriate policy responses and they're being effective, or they can be criticised if costs rise. So you need to think carefully about how you're reporting the costs, and again, whether you're reporting them as raw figures or as a proportion of what the economy is experiencing. Criminal justice agencies can also say that if cybercrime is increasing, then they need their budgets increased, or if cybercrime costs are reducing, then that might be an indication that policing is effective and their performance is improving. So a number of things to bear in mind when you're talking about the results. So finally, just some observations on what the future holds. I think we need to do much more research on what the computer-enabled cybercrime is really showing. What proportion of that is really related to criminality, and which part is due to cybercrime as we've defined it, and which part is related to cybersecurity costs. We need much more national survey research on what the public and private sector experience is of these types of crimes. Large-scale surveys by business and government sectors would be really useful to just improve the robustness of the evidence that we're talking about. And then a lot more research is needed on the indirect costs of cybercrime. So looking at what individuals are experiencing, and some of those very indirect costs, such as bad damage to business reputation, how cybercrime is affecting people's use of technology itself, a reduction in use of computers because people are afraid that they're going to be victimized, and also what the effect is on offenders. Are offenders being deterred by some of the action that's being taken? And finally, I think it'd be very useful to do some more intensive and detailed research comparing what's happening in Australia with what's happening in other countries, and particularly those countries that have got different prevention and response activities to Australia, just to try and map out which are the most effective in terms of expenditure and results. So a lot of work to do in the future, and I'm happy to field any questions that we might have.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. That was a very interesting talk. So please type your questions into the Q&A box. In the meanwhile, I think I'll kick off with, I have a couple of questions. First question about the final remark or your previous slide, and you said it before, countries count cybercrime, cost by cybercrime in a different way, which makes international comparison hard, I guess. Are you aware of any efforts in standardization of how to count these costs?
Yes, I think the work by the UK Home Office is a starting point. They've attempted to have a uniform set of definitions that certainly we've made use of in Australia and also in other countries. The other interesting aspect of standardization, I think, is the work of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. There's a European cybercrime convention, and if countries are making use of that in their own legislation, then that's going to create a eventual improvement in standardization across countries, rather than just allowing individual nations to develop their own definitions of particular crimes and the categories that they fall into. So I think having a UN agency like that involved is very important globally.
Yeah, I guess it can also be quite a political thing about what you count or what you don't count, depending on what the message is that you want to convey.
Yes. Yeah, politics have a lot to say in how work like this is done, yeah, and even funded.
Yeah. And so I haven't seen any question in the box yet. So keep typing. The other question I have is, look, one person's costs is another person's gain. So I guess cybercrime is just, you know, part of the world economy. Can you give an idea about, you know, where's the money going? Who is benefiting most from cybercrime? I mean, there will be the cyber criminals, of course, but there is also the IT people, there will be the lawyers, there will be the consultants, you know, and a whole bunch of other things. So, and also, do you have any idea how this goes international? For example, Australia, how much money does our economy lose to cybercrime, to other countries? And also, how much money maybe do we gain as an economy by cybercrime?
Yeah. Really important questions. Those benefits of a crime type are really important, and they're often overlooked because people don't like saying that crime is actually benefiting an economy. It's not a good look. But as you say, there's a lot of government departments and businesses that make you know, their living out of criminality. And cybercrime, that is definitely the case, as we can see in the computer security industry, which is thriving on the basis of the work of criminals. There's been a number of studies over the years trying to unpack what happens to money that's stolen in crime generally. And from the research we've done, which has mainly looked at fraud cases, a lot of it gets spent on lifestyle. So criminals will, you know, acquire illegally obtained funds and simply spend it on expensive cars, living expenses, travel, maintaining their own interests, and importantly, addictions. A lot of the money gets spent on either gambling or illicit drugs. So that's where a proportion of it goes. A lot of cyber-related profits are earned by organised crime groups, and they're often based overseas. So that's money which is being you know, extracted from Australia and is having a direct effect on the economy. It's very difficult to quantify that because it gets mixed in with other illegal proceeds of crime and can be recycled back into facilitating further organised crime itself, or it could be used on lifestyle by offenders overseas. Sometimes it's used to be laundered. It supports national economies and governments in developing countries. It's linked in with corruption in countries, so it gets disguised. And of course, there's a whole industry on money laundering, and illegal proceeds of crime get laundered in complex and sophisticated ways to make the money available for criminals to use without being detected by law enforcement.
Yeah, no, I guess in countries like North Korea are also already basing a part of their national economy on income from cybercrime. Yes.
And similarly, you know, some of the money that's made through child exploitation is just kept in those countries that are producing the illegal material, really. And we can think of, you know, there's a lot of Eastern Europe and European nations doing that. Southeast Asian as well.
Thank you. It's 9:45. If there are no further questions, the box, I don't see anything. Then I'm going to thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I sort of expected that counting cybercrime would be complicated, but it's even more complicated than I thought it would be. And I thought you presented that message very well. Very interesting. Thanks again